morning, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for accepting my proposal for this presentation in what is actually my debut as a speaker in this wonderful polyglot community, so I'm very excited to be here. I would like to begin this presentation with a genuine question. I would like to know how many of you are interested in or work with diasporic minoritized languages. Could you please raise your hand? How many of you are interested in or work with minoritized languages? Okay, so a good chunk of you. So that's precisely why I put together this presentation in the first place, because I want to share with you a notion of digital homelands and the ways in which these can be put to revitalize languages that we're interested in, particularly diasporic and minoritized languages. So I would like to tackle in this presentation two main questions. The first one is, what is a digital homeland with a hyphen? The hyphen is not accidental. I will explain why later on. And the second question is, how can we use this to make a positive impact in our communities? And so first question, what is a digital homeland? The idea of digital homeland is first defined in an article by Michael Held in 2010, where he defines a digital homeland as follows. A digital homeland, it's a virtual territory in which offline communities are reconstructed online. And this bare-bone definition includes at least two fundamental aspects. Now, the first one is the virtual rearticulation of collective identity. We are changing and reconstructive identity in these digital homelands. And second, there is a reassembling of the idealized, sometimes, target language community, in this case, the Ladino-speaking community. And have you noticed any lexical patterns in this slide? Pay attention to the verbs reconstruct, or to rearticulate, or to reassemble. All of these three point out to a process of decline, then a recovery, and then something else that happens as a result of that recovery. So a digital homeland actually implies three phases. The first one is language and community decline. And I think it's important to stress the extent to which the language and the community are linked, because sometimes we speak of languages as if they were abstract, self-contained entities, and I think it's important to emphasize the extent to which the decline of a language implies always already the parallel decline of a community, and vice versa. The revitalization of a language is also the revitalization of a community. And so there's a process of decline. After that, we have a digital revitalization, and what comes after the digital revitalization is no longer the offline reality prior to the decline, but in a new package, in the online package. It's something different. It's a renewed language and community. So I would like to walk you through these three stages. So the first one, the language decline. I'm going to use the example of Juedo-Spanish or Ladino. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this language. Definitely Richard is familiar with this language. And so Ladino or Juedo-Spanish, for those of you who've never heard of this, can be thought of as a diasporic, minoritized language, mostly spoken by the Jews who were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, from what is now Spain and Portugal at the end of the 15th century. And so there's been recently produced a film on this called La Hora Final, or The Final Hour, which I think summarizes what Ladino is about in a couple minutes in a very nice way. So it's basically, think of two ways of migration. The first one is the so-called Eastern Sephardim. So they will settle in these red arrows, right? They will settle in the north of Africa, in what is now Morocco and Algeria, and then in the Eastern Mediterranean, so Italy, Greece, nowadays Turkey, etc. And there's a subsequent migration that goes from Portugal to the north of Europe and also to the Americas. These are the so-called Western Sephardim, by opposition to the Eastern Sephardim in the red arrows. You can also think of Juedo-Spanish, and this is an analogy that I've been wanting to use for a long time because I think it's useful. Think of Juedo-Spanish as a pizza. So think of the dough as Castilian, Castilian of course being the hegemonic linguistic variety in the Iberian Peninsula prior to the expulsion, and then add on top of this the sauce of diaspora. Now we're going to include some toppings, and these toppings are metaphors for the long words that will enter the language as the Jews settle in the different countries of the diaspora. So say a community settles in nowadays Greece, so they will incorporate Greek terms such as piron, which means fork. Say they settle in Turkey, they will incorporate Turkish words such as hararet, which means desire. And so these are loan words from the languages that correspond to the territories where they settled. And on top of that, what we're seeing nowadays is a process of digital updating, of incorporating vocabulary that belongs to the realm of technology, and also including new genres and language forms in order to adapt to new realities. So a language decline presupposes and entails a historical process of deterioration. In the case of Ladino, this begins in the 1800s with a combination of Westernization, nationalism, and colonialism. What do I mean by this? First, you have a quote-unquote modernization of the Ottoman Empire. This means the Ottoman Empire opens up to further territories in Europe, and a consequence of this is an increased importance of dominant languages in Europe, of French and German in the Ottoman Empire. And that creates the weakening of local languages such as Juedo-Spanish or Ladino. In parallel to this, you have the introduction of Alliance Israélite Universelle, education for Sephardic Jewish children. This is an initiative that begins in the 1860s and is philanthropic in its spirit. So it aims at providing education to high-quality education to Sephardic children that otherwise wouldn't have the possibility to afford it. But to the extent to which it is conducted mostly in French, it results in the increased importance of French at the expense of Juedo-Spanish. And finally, we have the modern Spanish revisitation of the Sephardim, which means that since the 1860s, as a result of the Hispano-Moroccan War, the Spanish army enters Morocco, and there they find a community that speaks something that looks like Spanish, but is not quite like Spanish. Then they realize it's actually Juedo-Spanish. And when the news go back to the Iberian Peninsula that they have rediscovered this community of Sephardim, this starts a whole process of instrumentalizing this community to further the purposes of the Spanish state. And this includes processes of naturalization that go up to date, and the use of the Sephardic community as traders, as intermediaries in commerce activities. And of course, this means that Juedo-Spanish gets closer to Spanish, and this process is Hispanization. So long story short, whether it is French, German, or Spanish, in the 1800s, Juedo-Spanish loses importance in favor of bigger, stronger languages in Europe, Spanish, French, and German. Add to this, further reference, which I think might be useful for those of you that are interested in the connection between linguistics and colonialism, is this book by Louis-Jean Calvet called Linguistique et Colonialisme. And there it actually explains how colonialism and linguistics are intractably linked, rather than language being politicized a posteriori. I believe that the political is always already part of the language, not something that comes afterwards, right? So on top of this process, we have in World War II, of course, the Holocaust. According to Harris, in her 1994, the Sephardic population goes from 281,000 people to just 66,000 people. Entire communities, such as the Greek community of Thessalonica, are wiped out. 90% of Sephardic Jews from Salonika died in the Holocaust. And finally, we have Zionist nationalism and the creation of the State of Israel. Like the creation of any other state, this implies linguistic policies and planification. And in this particular case, what we have is a linguistic ideology of Hebrew monolingualism, which actually started already in the 19th century, but it gets officialized at this stage. And this means that Hebrew takes over Yiddish and Ladino as the official language of the state. Nevertheless, the State of Israel has developed also policies that are conducive to the revitalization of Ladino, such as the creation of the National Authority of Ladino and its Culture in 1997, and more recently, the creation of the Spanish Royal Academy of Juedo-Spanish in Israel, though these are not without their controversies. So in light of this historical decline, many authors speculated and hypothesized the eventual disappearance of Ladino. In particular, in her book, Death of a Language, History of Juedo-Spanish, Tracy Harris says, well, Ladino is going to disappear sooner than later, and this is due to two reasons. The first reason is the lack of a unified geographical territory. There's no such a thing as Sephardic Stan. There's no such a thing as a sovereign state where Juedo-Spanish is the official national language. And so that's going to be a problem. And the second is a weak intergenerational transmission. This means that the older generation is connected less and less to the younger generation in this language. So after 4 generations, the language is bound to disappear. However, by the same token, there where power is, there's also resistance, as Foucault used to say, right? So precisely because the disappearance of Ladino is predicated upon these two conditions, it suffices for us to redress any of this, to turn any of these around, let alone both of them, for Ladino to no longer be on the verge of disappearing. And that's exactly where the digital homeland comes in. What the emergence of the World Wide Web from the 1990s does is two things. It allows us to fight geographical isolation by creating a virtual community that connects people from all over the world, and it also facilitates intergenerational transmission. Be it because now the older generation has more possibilities of connecting with the younger generation, or be it because of the incorporation of the so-called digital natives, people who were born in the digital era as opposed to the analogical one. And there is a third condition identified by famous Jewish social linguist Joshua Fishman. He says, communication ought to be conducted exclusively or almost exclusively in the target language for language revitalization to be effective. We need to create what he calls diaglossic isolation or functional isolation, a place which is Juedo-Spanish only, which is Welsh only, which is Scottish Gaelic only, because that will create a strong incentive for people who want to be part of that community to participate in that language, since that's the only means they have to participate in that community. And so I want to present you here with 3 examples of how digital homelands operate in the case of Ladino, which I think are also amenable to other diasporic minoritized languages. The first one is Ladino Comunità. This is an email list that was created in 1999 by Rachel Bornik, who's a Sephardic Jew herself. This was created upon the initiative of famous Sephardic author Moshe Shaul from the National Authority of Ladino and its Culture. So in a 1999 Congress in Jerusalem, he said, we should create an email list that allows people from all over the world to connect through emails. And then Rachel said, yes, why not? Sure. Who wants to be part of that community? And just 4 or 5 people sign up for that. Just 4 or 5 people. Nowadays, it has evolved into a corresponding circle that features more than 2,000 people from 50 plus countries. So that's a remarkable effort. Here's an example of these kind of emails. The title of the email says, Refuah Shelema. Does anybody know what that means? Refuah Shelema is the name of a famous Jewish prayer for healing. So in Juedo-Spanish, when you want to wish someone a quick recovery, you say Refuah Shelema, right? And the content goes, Cuando estuve en Cal lunes, when I was at the synagogue on Monday, el primer día de Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the Jewish New Year, estuve con vuestro amigo Alberto Bejar. I was with my friend Alberto Bejar, que me dijo que su mujer, Rebecca, who told me that his wife, Rebecca, se cayó en su casa, fell at home, y se rompió el hombro and broke her shoulder. Rebecca estaba en hospital. She was at the hospital. Agora está en casa. Now she's at home. Le deseamos una recuperación muy presto. We wish her a quick, speedy recovery. And what fascinates me about this initiative is that at the end of the email, you have, of course, the name of the person who sends the email, but also where that person is from, in this case, Florida, and where that person is currently, in this case, Washington. And that creates a sense of global community where people can actually see where the message comes from and feel part of the same virtual entourage. That's the first initiative. The second initiative is so-called Ladino Forever. This is not my translation. The name of this initiative was actually in English to begin with. It's Ladino Forever, created in 2016 by Michal Halfi, who lives in Istanbul, Turkey. And in this initiative, we can see performances, songs in Ladino, and also a very important component of Sephardic literature, which are proverbs that contain the Sephardic wisdom. Here's an example. This is a Facebook post by this page, and it says, "En cada casa y en cada cajón hay un dolor de corazón." Which means in every home and in any drawer, there's heartache to be found. And you can see that these are pretty popular posts, and people interact in all sorts of ways. Elias Recanati, presumably a Sephardic Jew judging on the surname, though we don't really know, adds knowledge to this and says, "Oh, ninguno sabe el mal de la olla, solo la cuchars que la manea," which means no one knows the troubles of others except the spoon that stirs those troubles, that stirs up those troubles. And finally, there's another example of a platform that I actually created in 2017 called Ladino 21. It's called Ladino 21 and not Ladino 13 or Ladino 14 because we aim at showcasing how Ladino is spoken in the 21st century as opposed to the 13th century, right? And so I co-created this with colleagues Alejandro and Benny, halfway between Zaragoza, Spain, which is my hometown, and New York City, which is where Benny Aguado, who's a Sephardic Jew, is from, and also where I've been living for the last 5 years as part of my PhD education. What I want to show you is a video where a famous Sephardic singer, Sara Aroeste, whose family is from Macedonia, is using a language learning platform to teach Ladino to her kids.
Buenos dias.
Now your turn.
Buenos dias.
That was really good. Both of you.
Buenos dias.
Now your turn.
Buenos dias.
That was
Do
so
X
good.
bars. I want to do X bar.
No, X means you got it wrong, but you got it right. Okay, so let's just review.
Por favor.
Sí.
Sí, por favor.
It's por favor.
Yeah, I know. Por favor.
That was good.
Por favor.
Yeah, good. Por favor.
Por favor.
Okay, now how do you say no?
No.
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 And how do you say no thanks? You say no merci.
No merci. Merci. No merci.
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 We didn't do that.
Merci.
Merci.
We didn't do
Por
that.
Oh,
favor.
whoopsie. Now we're going to do this one.
Merci mucho.
Merci mucho means thank you very much. Merci mucho.
Merci mucho.
Merci mucho.
Merci mucho.
So you have lexical differences, as you saw with gracias in current Spanish or merci in Juedo-Spanish. You also have spelling differences, such as mucho and mucho. And finally, you have pronunciation differences, as in current Spanish, we will say sí por favor, whereas in Juedo-Spanish is sí por favor. It's a fricative V. So the pronunciation is different, even though the spelling is the same. So here are some of the comments on a further video on Joha's story. So as you can see, some people reply in Spanish. Here's a person from Argentina saying, muy hermoso el cuento. Le comento que soy de Argentina y entendí absolutamente todo. Right? I go, absolutely everything. I'm from Argentina, and I couldn't notice any big differences between Castilian, that Castilian, meaning Juedo-Spanish, and the one that is spoken in my country, meaning in Argentina, right? Other people, this is very interesting because this person comments in Spanish, right? Muy bueno, like very good, but then he or she says, alegre que estés, instead of que estés alegre. So the word order is a word order that we can only observe in Juedo-Spanish, but everything else is Spanish, including the spelling, etc. A further person comments on English, saying, oh, Joha is a very famous person in Arabic countries. I don't speak Spanish, but I could understand that you signify the Turkish roots of this personage and some of his tales. By the way, I discovered also what is Ladino language, and beep, it's so beautiful. And some other people comment directly in Juedo-Spanish, like, qué buen cuenticico, meaning such a good little story. And then we always get this. We always get this, like, what is this language, right? Like, su lengua es una variante del castellano. Is your language a variety of Castilian? I got the bulk of it, right? Entendí la mayor parte, and it's the first time that I hear this language. Beautiful story. and then some more prosaic comments. Muy bueno. Okay, so these are the 3 examples of digital homelands in Ladino, whether it's exclusively in Ladino or almost exclusively in Ladino. And so I show you the language decline, the online revitalization, and now what do we have in the end? I think it's very important to stress the fact that the online does not only function as a repository of offline realities, but it's also a creative force on its own. It generates its own offline realities. It's not just that you take the offline and then you put it online in a new package, but the old reality. By putting it in a new package, you actually generate a different reality. Let me give you some examples. For instance, you generate a new sense of ethnic identity, a new imagined community. I'm sure you're familiar with this notion of imagined community, first coined by Anderson in his 1983. And there he said the following. He said, "The members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members." Take, for instance, Luxembourg, right? And think of the following. Just because I'm from a small nation such as Luxembourg, it doesn't mean I will get to know everybody else from Luxembourg during my lifetime. Nevertheless, despite this, in the minds of each of the people from Luxembourg lives the image of their communion. They still are able to recognize each other as members of the same national community, even though they don't necessarily need to know each other in person, right? And so this is similar to what happens in the digital homeland, but at the same time is also different. How so? Well, the claim of Anderson contains 2 claims, the home and the land, right? The home is the idea that people have an imagined relation between themselves. It's not imaginary because it's not unreal, but it's imagined because it's mediated through imagination. I have to imagine that that person belongs to the same national community. I have to imagine it because I don't have that person in front of me, right? And the land claim is the fact that these 2 people are actually members of the same sovereign state. And that's where the difference lies with regard to Ladino and digital homelands. In the case of Ladino, the people who write in Ladino Community in an email list from, say, Brazil, and another person responds from Australia, they do not belong to the same sovereign state, as Anderson was thinking. They belong to different sovereign states, and yet they share the home component. They share the home minus the land. And that's why I speak of digital homeland with a hyphen, because it is not necessary for you to share the home. It is not necessary to belong to the same sovereign state to share the land. It might as well be the case that you share the home minus the land, which is contrary to what Anderson was thinking. Anderson was thinking, you share the home because you share the land. You imagine each other as belonging to the same national community because you are actually citizens of the same country, which does not need to happen in Juedo-Spanish because there's no geographical unified territory such as Sephardistan, right? Another way in which the online generates offline social realities is, for instance, Latino Community. Here's a trip of members of this email list to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. They met each other online, but then they decided, well, we share so much in common that I would actually like to meet you up in real life, right? Offline. And that's how the online generated an offline reality. A further example is Ladino 21. This is me in Brazil with Sephardic Jews Clara Cohen and Yildiz, like a Turkish name that translates into Estrellita, or little star. This began with me writing in Ladino Community and saying, okay, I need to go to Brazil for an academic conference. Is there any Sephardic Jews in Sao Paulo who will be here from this date to this one and that speak Juedo-Spanish? I would like to meet up. And so a couple people replied and said, yes, I'll be in Sao Paulo from this date to this date. I would like to meet up and speak some Juedo-Spanish, to charlación, as we say in Juedo-Spanish, which means to have a talk, a charlación. And that's how I got to meet them, and we share actually these borecas, which are a traditional Sephardic dish, and we spoke for like 3 hours, and it was great. So that's another way in which the online communication generates its own offline reality. And both the trip to the trip to the Israeli parliament and the trip to Brazil are best summarized in the following kind of funny paragraph by Reingold. He says, "My 7-year-old daughter knows that her father congregates with a family of invisible friends who seem to gather in his computer. Sometimes he talks to them, even if nobody else can see them. And she knows that these invisible friends sometimes show up in the flesh, materializing from the next block or the other side of the planet. That's a very interesting perspective on how a kid thinks of digital homelands and the offline realities they generate. And finally, the digital also engenders new genres and new language forms and platforms. Take this, for instance. This is a hip-hop version. There's no video, no worries. There's a hip-hop version of a very traditional Sephardic song called La Vida Do por el Raki. Right? El Raki is a very iconic, idiosyncratic alcoholic drink in the Balkans. And so it made its way in Juedo-Spanish too. And so they take a traditional song and make a hip-hop cover and disseminate it through YouTube. And then it becomes a new genre. A further example is this. In Ladino 21, we started creating memes, actually. There were no memes in Juedo-Spanish prior to digital homelands. And so we took this famous comedian / actor that you know, and we just wrote this. Cuando te auguran feliz año 2020, when they wish you happy new year 2020, but you're already in 5,780. I mean, with a reference to the Jewish calendar, right? It's an in-joke. So, yeah, people like that. And this gentleman, Alberto Noé, was kind enough to wish us con berajá y salud cumplida, which means with prosperity. Berajá being the Hebrew word for prosperity, and salud cumplida, and full health. So may you have prosperity and full health. And the last example is this. The last example is a language learning app that we developed in partnership with UTalk just last year, which is the first of its kind in Ladino. And so I heard about UTalk a couple of years ago, and then I spoke to the CEO and I said, do you have Ladino? Because they have a lot of courses on minoritized languages, diasporic ones. And so I said, you have to have Ladino in here. And he was very open to the idea, and it took us 9 months to develop this, and we presented this course in actually last December, so December last year in Cine House, London. And that's actually the application that the famous singer Sara Aroeste was using with her kids for the purpose of teaching them Ladino. So that's pretty much all from me. If you liked this idea of digital homeland, you're welcome to subscribe to Ladino 21. Also to join us in the platform Language Freedom, which seeks to empower individuals and communities through effective language learning, and also to develop kind of a critical consciousness on the ideological, cultural, and socio-political implications of learning a language. Ladies and gentlemen, merci mucho. Thank you very much. Right, so as to the question as to whether Yiddish is closer to German or Ladino is closer to Spanish, I would like to know much more about Yiddish for me to be able to answer that question. I can say, nevertheless, that Yiddish has had a bigger social support in general, and so there's a course, for instance, on Duolingo about Yiddish. I did contact Duolingo back in the day to do a Ladino course. Never heard back from them. And so I think Yiddish is in a stronger position right now. If I read Yiddish, which I've tried sometimes, because I know German, if I read it out loud, I can more or less comprehend what the message is about. But I would say, from my perspective and limited knowledge of Yiddish, I would say Ladino is closer to Spanish than Yiddish is to German. Right, so the question, thank you. So the question as to how is Ladino Britain? This is a very important question, fascinating one also politically. That's why I was speaking about the critical perspective on the ideological implications of Ladino. Yeah, I've seen Ladino being written in Solitreo, which is a cursive alphabet used in the Ottoman Empire, in Rashi, Hebrew alphabet, in Merubah, Hebrew but printed form. In Greek, I've also read Ladino in Cyrillic. I've read Tefillot, like books of prayers of Ladino in Cyrillic. And definitely the idea and the normalization that Ladino is written in the Latin script is a very recent idea. And Aki Yerushalayim, for instance, is a Sephardic journal in Israel that pushed for that, and others follow suit. And now in Ladino Comunidad, for instance, also the Latin alphabet is prescribed as the ideal one. And on the one hand, I would say it obeys to the linguistic ideology of pan-Latinism, which is the idea that languages ought to be written in Latin alphabet, Latin script, such as, for instance, writing Chinese in Pinyin, right? That's a way of making it accessible to. So on the one hand, you can say that it's about making it accessible to other people, but there's also the political claim of, and the identitarian claim of some people in Israel, for instance, still write Juedo-Spanish in Hebrew characters because they feel that that's how it should be written because it's closer to their Jewish ethnic identity. So there's also a political claim to be made there. Yeah. Thank you. No hay por cuál.